So very little information.
David, we're going to have to cut you off. President Bush is speaking.
A moment for America. I unfortunately will be going back to Washington after my remarks. Secretary of Rod Page and Lieutenant Governor will take the podium and discuss education. I do want to thank the folks here at Booker Elementary School for their hospitality. Today we've had a national tragedy. Two airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand. And now, if you join me in a moment of silence. May God bless the victims, their families, and America. Thank you very much.
U.S. soil. They're mentioning the two planes that have crashed into the World Trade Center this morning. It says a full-scale investigation is underway to hunt down those responsible for this, saying terrorism will not stand.
And Leon, on the heels of the president's remarks, CNN has learned that at least one of the planes involved in this hit on the World Trade Center was an American Airlines 767, a Boeing aircraft that took off from Boston. What happened to that airplane as it took off from Boston and how it ended up at the World Trade Center, our details will have to fill in as we go. But let's go ahead and bring in our David Ensor. David, you were saying before we interrupted you for the president's remarks.
Well, unfortunately, the amount of detail that the officials who are tracking this have is pretty sketchy at this point. But I was just saying that officials are calling this an act of terrorism. They're saying that's clearly what it is, clearly not an accident. And law enforcement agencies, the FBI and others, will be taking the lead on this, officials say. And clearly, obviously, they will first try to ascertain who did this. What nationality are they? What's behind this? That's really all I can say. There are several places around the government. There are groups of officials gathering and setting up crisis centers to try and deal with the flow of information on this, which, as you can imagine, is going to be considerable as the day progresses.
And so far, as we know, no one has been taking responsibility for this.
There have been no claims of responsibility, and U.S. intelligence officials say they had no warning of anything like this coming along.
All right, David Ensor, thank you for joining us on the phone. Once again, you can see that information at the bottom of your screen. Two different planes have flown into the World Trade Center within the last hour. One plane was an American Airlines Boeing 767 from Boston. In terms of how many people were on board that plane and if it was forcibly taken from Boston into New York, we still have yet to learn.
We're joined now on the telephone by the former Federal Emergency Management Agency Director James Lee Witt. Director Witt, you're watching these pictures with us this morning. Your comments?
Well, it's just horrible. There's no doubt. I did see the one plane flying into the building. It's just unbelievable, something like this. But, you know, we've been for several years now, we've been working on terrorist-type events, and, and this is apparently one of those events. Do not know yet, but apparently it could be. And right now, I know I really feel for those families, but Richie and the New York Emergency Management, the state of New York, and I know they're very busy right now in the FBI and law enforcement. But this is one of those crisis management, as well as a consequence management situation that they're going to have to be dealing with.
You know, the first thing that calls to mind to many of us who have been here to cover these events was the World Trade Center bombing back in was it '96 when that bombing occurred?
Yes.
And you were director of FEMA at that particular time. Since then, has there been a plan put in place for something like this, to recover from this, or to go through the exercises necessary to get people out and to recover from it?
Well, they have a very good plan in place, and for even events, not as this. I don't think I don't know if they put a plan in place for airline crashing into it, but I know take every scenario they could think of and try to deal with a plan that will help them respond in the most effective way. And you know, we even practice airplanes flying into igloos, you know, and at some of the arsenals around the United States. So you try to practice for everything you can think of and hope for the best, and that you can be able to respond and hope none of this happens. But
well, on that note, then, did you run any kinds of tests at all, or any kinds of, I don't know, theoretical tests or computer tests or anything on something like this?
We didn't. I'm not sure if New York City did. I'm sure they did. But you know, you can't. How can you stop something like this without having an anti-aircraft gun sitting on top of buildings? You know.
Yeah.
You just can't. You can prepare the best you can be, and that's all you can do. But I'm sure that they've got everything in place and doing. They always do an excellent job up there in New York.
Director James Lee Witt, former director of FEMA, we thank you very much for your time this morning. We'll be talking with you later on.
As we continue our coverage, our Aaron Brown in New York City joining us now. Aaron, we can see over your left shoulder there the building still smoldering of the World Trade Center.
Well, it is a grotesque sight to look at from about 30 blocks away from where we are. For those of you just joining us, let's just briefly recap what we know. About an hour ago, about 8:45 Eastern Time, one plane crashed into the tower, the World Trade Center tower on the right, the first of those towers that you can see behind me. And then about a half hour later, a second plane crashed into the tower number 2. That's the one to the left, where the darker smoke is billowing out right now. We have reports, CNN has been told that one of the planes was an American Airlines 767 that had been hijacked from Boston. We don't know if that was the first or the second plane that hit the tower, but we do know that it was a 767 American Airlines jet. At least that's what CNN has been told by sources so far this morning. We also have reports of 1,000 injuries. That is unconfirmed, and we always remind you in moments like these that as these initial reports come in, it is very early. I can tell you, driving in, it is extraordinarily chaotic on the west side of New York. It is the kind of situation where numbers change, where situations change, but this is the information we have now, that there are at least 1,000 injuries, and we're working on that. As you can see, the smoke billowing out of the Trade Center. In Sarasota, Florida now, Major Garrett joins us. Major, what are you being told?
Hello. President Bush has notified, and talked rather, to Vice President Cheney. He has talked to the FBI Director, Robert Mueller, and he has also spoken with the Governor of New York, Governor Pataki, about this catastrophe. The President will convene a national security meeting upon his arrival back at Washington. Those are the 4 pieces of information we have gathered here in the moment since I just spoke to you on the telephone. The President, as we just saw a few moments ago, identifying this as an apparent act of terrorism against the United States, said there will be a full investigation. The entire apparatus, the United States government, FBI, national security, CIA, the Vice President, who you may remember was placed in charge of a domestic terrorism study group within the White House to monitor and develop plans to deal with a catastrophe of just this kind. All those parts of the government have been mobilized. The President is heading back to Washington very soon. Here's what the President said about this catastrophe at the Twin Towers in New York just a few moments ago here at Sarasota Elementary School.
Major, it's Aaron.
Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand. And now, if you join me in a moment of silence. May God bless the victims, their families, and America. Thank you very much.
The president was first.
Again, 2 planes have crashed into the World Trade Center towers, 110 stories tall, each in New York City. The FBI says that this is certainly no accident. They believe that this is indeed a terrorist act. So far, no one has claimed responsibility, and there was absolutely no warning of this, the FBI says. Here is what we know at this time as details continue to trickle in on this Tuesday morning. One of those airplanes involved, we don't know if this was the first plane crash or the second, was an American Airlines 767 Boeing aircraft that took off or was hijacked from Boston. We do not know how many people were on board this aircraft. We're still trying to gather that kind of information. As for the second plane, we do not know what kind of plane was involved in that second crash that happened just 18 minutes after the first crash. Witnesses do say, though, that they believe it was a smaller plane. We are still awaiting word on victims and casualties and rescue efforts. CNN does report that at least 1,000 injuries have been reported. Again, this is very new information still trickling in, but the FBI does believe that this is most certainly an act of terrorism. Now, some background here on the World Trade Center in New York. The towers were struck by Muslim bombers in 1993. This did kill 6 people. Again, as for casualties and injuries in this incident, in these incidents, we always like to remind you that we are just getting this information in. Exact numbers have not come in just yet. Let's go ahead and listen in.
We underline the point that it is postponed. We are not going to see the business of America deferred because of terrorism, whether it's in education or in any area of public policy. We're looking forward to hearing from the First Lady on a subject matter which is of central concern to all families in this country, and because of her experience and her leadership, this committee and the Congress and the American people would have benefited greatly from her comments, and we will look forward to an early
Senator Ted Kennedy in Washington. Chris Plant, a CNN producer, is at the Pentagon, where there is a significant fire. Chris, you're on the phone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
Tell me what you know.
Well, arriving at the Pentagon a short time ago, there was a huge plume of smoke which continues to rise from the west side of the Pentagon over in the area where there is a helicopter landing zone. It's along Route 27 if you're looking at maps of the area. The building is currently being evacuated, and police and emergency units are, of course, responding from all around the building and from the local Arlington County Fire Department. The plume of smoke is enormous. It's a couple of 100 yards across. At its base, it is billowing into the sky, hundreds of yards. It's impossible for me to say from this side of the building whether the building itself is on fire or up in flames, or exactly what caused this. I did not hear an explosion, but there is certainly a very, very significant fire in this enormous office building on the west front. The building is being evacuated. The Defense Protective Service officers, the police force for the Pentagon, are on a very tight string right now. As I arrived, I was held at gunpoint.
Chris, yes. let me interrupt you for a second. Just hang on. Don't go anywhere. We're getting reports now that the White House is being evacuated as well. We don't know precisely what has caused that decision to be made, whether that is precautionary, whether something has happened at the White House. Again, the president is in Florida this morning, so the president is not in any danger, but the White House, of course, is fully operational, whether the president is there or not, and we have reports that the White House is being evacuated. Getting back to Chris in a moment, we also have reports now from Chris Plant on the scene that the Pentagon is being evacuated as well. All of this coming on the heels of a large fire at the Pentagon, and we can't tell you at this moment whether that fire is inside the Pentagon building itself or on the ground to the Pentagon. And these 2 planes that you can see behind us that hit the World Trade Center, that's Washington, the old executive office building, I believe, and you can see the plume of smoke behind it, which we will assume until we're told otherwise that that's the fire at the Pentagon. I believe that's correct. As you look now at Washington. So we've got a major fire at the Pentagon and the Pentagon being evacuated.